Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. And today I'm here with Dr. Peter Richerson. He is a Distinguished Professor Emeritus of the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of California, Davis. He is a biologist with interest in cultural evolution, animal social learning, and mathematical models. He is also the author of books like Culture and the Evolutionary Process, Not by Genes Alone, How Culture Transformed Human Evolution, and The Origin and Evolution of Cultures, all of them written in collaboration with Dr. Robert Boyd. So, Dr. Richerson, it's a real pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you a lot for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Okay, great. So, the first question I would like to ask you, Dr. Richerson, is why would a biologist like you become interested in studying culture and cultural evolution and other processes like that?
Well, I got interested in it because I was asked to teach a course with a colleague. I was hired into an interdisciplinary teaching unit, and half of my departmental colleagues were social scientists, and a sociologist. It was a brand new department. My sociologist colleague had been instrumental in setting up the new department. He'd written a course into the books called The Principles of Human Ecology, and when it came time to teach it, he wanted to teach it with a natural scientist. And so I learned through some casual reading that there were people who called themselves cultural ecologists, anthropologists who called themselves cultural ecologists. And I had pretty good training in evolution, so I thought if there are cultural adaptations, then there ought to be a process like processes like natural selection that generated those adaptations. So I went to the library looking to find out what these cultural ecologists thought about cultural adaptations, and it turned out their thoughts on the subject were actually pretty crude. So I was teaching a different course with Rob Boyd at the same time, and he and I fell to talking about what I'd discovered in going to the library to get material for lectures, and we eventually decided that there was a rich that you could use the same basic concepts and tools that evolutionary biologists use to study the evolution of genes and apply them to culture. So that's the long and the short of it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, so I think that it is very important for us to start off by defining what is culture, because I mean I've been talking a lot with anthropologists and people who do work in cultural evolution and even evolutionary psychologists, but it is a bit difficult for people to agree on a definition of culture. So what would be your definition, or perhaps the one that is considered the best for anthropology and other disciplines like that?
Well, it's endlessly controversial, but everybody points to the same general kinds of things, I think. And so Rob and I have defined culture as those things that you acquire by imitation and teaching from other people. So it's a form of information that spreads from one person to another. You work out of behave, you imitate other people, or your parents teach you. Rob and I have defined culture as those things information that you acquire from other people by teaching and learning. Teaching and imitation. So that's the basic definition we use. There are lots of definitions of culture, but I think they all have something in common, which is this acquisition of information from other people by teaching and learning, teaching and imitation,
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, and since we're talking about culture and cultural evolution, Are there any units of selection? Because I guess that we are comparing cultural evolution with biological or genetic evolution in this case. So since the unit of selection in biology or of evolutionary biology is the gene, is there a correspondent thing in cultural evolution, like, for example, ideas, beliefs, norms, or something like that?
Yes, all of those kinds of things count. There are many domains of culture, from things like subsistence techniques, skills. Now, people think that in biology that the gene is the unit, and that it's all a very clean system of selection on genes. But that's a bit of a mistake in biology as well. So selection in the first instance falls on phenotypic characters like height, for example, or other dimensional features like that are essentially continuous, because there are so many genes contributing to the phenotype that you can't identify particular genes that at least it's difficult to do that. And culture, we don't have any reason to think that there are gene-like units anyway. In other words, pollsters measure people's political preferences on a continuous scale from right to left, right? And there's no reason to think that it isn't a quantitative character, a lot like genetic characters. On the other hand, some things are pretty discrete. So you belong to a particular religion, or you are a citizen of a particular country, or you're not. And that's a little bit like we have a cultural gene, so to speak, and I have an American one, you can. So in terms of mathematical models that we build, we've looked at both continuously varying characters and discrete characters. And I think it's a case by case basis. In the case of culture, we don't have any reason to expect we'll ever find a particular unit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But when we think about culture, we usually associate it with humans. But does it also occur in other species of animals?
Well, it seems to turn out that social animals almost always have some at least rudimentary form of social learning, culture, if you want. Now, the difference is that humans have a sort of a massively cumulative culture. So we're talking over the internet with using computers and very fancy pieces of machinery. I wonder how many patents there are in our thousands, I suppose. So it's like that have a considerable length of time, piling one innovation on top of another to make extremely complicated objects. And our social organization is similar. We operate very complicated societies using institutions and rules. And although there's some rudimentary accumulation in other animals' cultures, nothing that approaches the complexity of human culture.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in that sense, could we say that culture is another aspect of the phenotype of certain organisms like humans and other social animals?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you refer to the fact that humans have a cumulative culture. Would you say that perhaps another big difference between us and other social animals is the fact that humans tend to imitate and even over-imitate in comparison with other animals, that perhaps there isn't any other animal that imitate fellow beings like we do?
Well, I think that the evidence from experimental studies, say comparing chimpanzees' abilities to learn socially with human abilities to learn socially, humans are much more accurate imitators than other animals, and particularly if you encourage people to think that some particular cultural act is should be performed very accurately, like a ritual, like a religious ritual. People get very compulsive about doing exactly what their model has done, and we don't see that as far as so far in any other animal besides humans. We're the most accurate and speedy imitators or recipients of teaching compared to chimpanzees, who are pretty good social learners, but they're not nearly as good as humans.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and in terms of our cognition as humans, what would you say are perhaps the more important aspects of it that we have to consider when studying the cognitive basis of culture and culture transmission?
Well, the developmental college has studied how the capacity for imitation gets assembled in children. So by the age of about 12 months, kids are quite proficient imitators, and a number of things seem to go into it. People have an advanced theory of mind, cognitive psychologists say, by which they mean that people know, assume that another human being behind of their caretaker, and they try to understand what people are using their mind for, and this seems to enable imitation. Some things are quite simple. So kids have what's called joint attention. So if a caregiver is paying attention to something, they use pointing gestures and things like that to call a kid's attention to an object that the caretaker is wants the child to pay attention to, and they readily do that. That's they don't follow gaze and pointing. Interestingly enough, domestic dogs follow human pointing gestures, and wolves don't. So this is a capacity that we bred into dogs, probably inadvertently, but we want to train dogs, and dogs want to be trained because they want to please people, and so they have a bit of the same psychology evolved in them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess that we could say that it has a lot to do with how our learning processes work. But apart from that, there are also a series of biases that influence the way we acquire cultural information, like, for example, content biases, context biases, frequency biases. That is, we tend to acquire information from other people in our environment, following certain innate proclivities, right?
That's what it seems. It seems to be the case. Yes. So in the case. The biases that we use to acquire culture, you could think of them as even pretty small children are smart shoppers in the marketplace of ideas, and some of the techniques that they use are, for example, they come to understand that some people are competent and some people are incompetent, and they prefer to imitate people who are competent in experimental situations. They also prefer to imitate people that are like them. And one of the cues is language or dialect. So if you have two models, one of which speaks the same language or the dialect as the kid, and one who doesn't, they'll prefer to imitate the people who are like them in terms of dialect. Interestingly, they're more prone to use language as a cue than skin color. That probably makes sense, because in the past, people wouldn't be exposed much to people who are physically very different from them. And before 500 years ago, neighboring people would be very similar with regard to things like skin color and other than physical attributes like skin color. So skin color would be kind of an irrelevant variable in the evolutionary past, whereas dialect would be a very salient one. And kids seem to reflect that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, isn't it true that learning processes and the acquisition of culture are things that are cognitively costly? So would it make sense for us to say that perhaps in humans those things evolved and were adaptive because during the Pleistocene period, and as we evolved as Homo sapiens, we were exposed to fluctuating environments, and so that would be a reason why it would be favorable from an evolutionary perspective for us to be able to acquire and develop culture as we do.
Yes, that's the upshot of the functional analysis of culture that Rob and I did in our 1985 book. What would costly capacity for culture be good for? And our conclusion was that it would be useful in environments that vary temporally or spatially, and in particular that culture seems to be an adaptation to environmental variations that occur at an intermediate time scale or spatial scale. So if environments are changing very slowly, then selection on genes will track the environmental variation fairly well. On the other hand, if it's varying hugely from one generation to the next, then only mechanisms of phenotypic flexibility like individual learning would be useful. So the mold to fluctuate on time scales of 1,000 years or so. So it takes a few generations for cultural adaptations to be perfected, particularly. And on the end, if the environment are varying slowly enough, then genes will keep up, and cost capacity for culture would be most advantageous in terms of temporal variation. When there's a lot of variation on the time scales of centuries to a millennium. And that seems to be characteristic of the Pleistocene, as you mentioned. There's an enormous amount of variation during ice ages, at least on time scales of 1,000 years or so, and shorter time scales. So that seems to be the kind of world that would favor cultural evolution. Another spatial variation is interesting as well. So that one of the things that the cooling of the Earth in the last few million years meant that about the same temperature, and the poles have gotten very cold indeed, covered with ice, and so there's more spatial variation on the pole to latitude gradient than there was in past environments. So that it's another thing we adapt finely to on a fine scale to spatial variation. So for their agricultural subsistence systems to the environment, different cultivars in different habitats and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but since there were other animals that also were exposed to those fluctuating environmental conditions, is it the case that it was humans who really developed this capacity for accumulating culture and things like that, because perhaps we were the ones that had the correct pre-adaptations for cultural acquisition and accumulation, or not?
Yeah, I think that's that's certainly my interpretation of our history. Is humans come from a lineage that has larger than average brains of primates, particularly the apes have relatively large brains. Humans then became bipedal with the Australopithecines, and that our hands to become specialized for making. So I think that humans have three critical pre-adaptations. One is a relatively large brain that we inherited from our ape ancestors. The second is our free hands, that we inherited from our Australopithecine ancestors. Once they became bipedal, our forelimbs didn't need to involve locomotion, and so people became able to use their hands in a very precise way. So we have a power grip, and we can bang on stones in a way that allows us to make stone tools. And people have gone to a lot of trouble to try to get chimpanzees to make stone tools, and they just aren't that good at it because their hands aren't set up for making stone tools. So technology is a specialty that we have special important adaptive feature of culture that depends upon having our hands. And finally, the third pre-adaptation, I think, is we're pretty social animals. So we lived in fairly large troops, and the other major thing that culture does is allow us to build complex societies using rules so that we can transmit by language. And so I think those three pre-adaptations meant that humans became much more cultural than other animals. Now, other animals also got brainier recently, so there's a long-term trend toward larger brains in many mammalian lineages. So it's not that we're completely unique. The other animals have presumably been getting more cultured in response to the same environmental fluctuations and more individual learning. Big brains seem to be good for both individual and social learning. So the other animals have been adapting in the same general way, but humans having those pre-adaptations to this fancy cumulative culture.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And in what circumstances does culture also become part of the environment, and it becomes another selective pressure on humans, for example? Because I mean, we've been talking about culture as being another aspect of an organism's phenotype, but from a certain point on, at least, there are at least some parts of culture that also exert selective pressures on our genomes, like we have in gene culture coevolution, right?
Right. So, I mean, one of the things we do is build shelters and modify the environment in various ways. So here we are, tropical apes by ancestry, and we have populations that live north of the Arctic, that have fancy clothing and fancy shelters, and so people who live in the Arctic are compact people, so they've evolved to slow down their rate of heat loss. So we don't depend just on clothing, but clothing allows us to pioneer in very cold environments and shelters, and then selection actually alters our biology to cope with those cold conditions, because every once in a while your boat capsizes or your climate. So I think the best worked out example we have of gene culture coevolution is adult lactase. So all young mammals have an enzyme lactase to break into, it's a 12 carbon sugar, to break it into two 6 carbon sugars that you can then absorb through your gut. And so at the same time, it's useful enzyme once we age of the production of lactase ceases in most mammals and in most human populations as well. But in populations like Europeans that have a long history of dairying, we have adult lactase persistence. So lactase just doesn't, it's broken in humans that have adult lactase persistence. So we produce lactase throughout our lives, and that makes it easier to drink milk, and we get more calories out of milk. About 40% of the calories in milk are in lactose, and animals that don't have lactase can't get that nutrition from the milk sugar. So it seems as if dairying has repeatedly caused the evolution of adult lactase persistence. So in dairying populations in Africa, but not in populations that don't have a long history of dairy, Africans also have this adult lactase persistence. And other people that don't have a long history of dairying, for example, East Asians, their lactase production just shuts down when they're about the time they're weaned, just like it does in all other mammals. So that's a situation where where culture set up an environment where lactose was a potentially useful item of nutrition for adults, and then selection on that created selection on genes for this lactase persistence trait.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so since I've already had people on the show like Dr. Leda Cosmides, we talked about the concept that she and Dr. Tooby created of the evoked culture, that is, certain aspects of our environment evoking culture or certain cultural traits in groups of people. But now that I'm talking with you, it seems that that's not all that there is to culture, because it seems to me, at least from all of what you've just been saying, that there are also aspects of culture that they themselves change perhaps some innate proclivities that we have, and I mean, in your books you also talk about how culture might influence even things like our mating systems and other aspects like that, correct?
Yes, John and Leda historically have argued that people have many purpose cognitive modules that guide our behavior. And Rob's and my position is that the biases that we have are much more general purpose than that, and our cultural content is not closely controlled by specific biases for mating, for example. Now we certainly do have biological adaptations for mating. A neurobiologist by the name of Jack Panksepp studied the emotional proclivities of mammals in general, and he argues that there are these highly conserved brain stem features in mammals that give us a specific suite of emotions, and one of the emotions, as he calls lust, is certainly closely related to mating. And but humans endlessly tinker with mating, right? Historically, Western Europeans delayed marriage until they had a living were able to make a living, and in the early modern period, Europeans tended to marry quite late in life compared to most other human populations. So that's an example of regulation. And it turns out that in those periods, the number of children that were born out of wedlock seems to have been so small that demographers ignore it. We can control our lust to fit cultural patterns of mating.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's very interesting because if I'm not mistaken, at least initially, the sociobiologists argued that when referring to culture, that the only types of cultural content that would be successfully transmitted between generations would be the ones that would contribute to increasing our fitness, either personal or inclusive. But it is also the case that there are aspects of culture that might even be maladaptive, correct?
Sure. And the recent demographic transition in human populations it seems to me is a spectacular example. So most human populations now are engaged in at least starting their demographic transition, by which demographers mean going from a situation where the completed fertility of the average woman is something like 7 births per woman to under, I don't know what Portugal is now, but probably a bit under 2, right? So we're not even, many societies aren't even at replacement fertility there. And in countries like Japan that underwent their demographic transition fairly recently, but a rather extreme demographic transition, the population is shrinking. And at the same time, we have a few cultures or subcultures, you might call them, the North American Anabaptists, the Amish and the Hutterites and the Mennonites. Many of their communities still have completed fertilities on the order of 7 kids per woman, and so those populations are exploding at the same time. Many other populations are slowly shrinking. So we certainly can acquire what look like cultural maladaptations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and since we've already touched a little bit on some alternatives people have been putting forth, alternatives to your and Dr. Boyd's approach to culture and cultural evolution, like Cosmides and Tooby's evoked culture, and also the sociobiologists. Could you please tell us also a little bit about memetics as an alternative approach, and perhaps the places where you think it fails as an approach to explain how human culture works and is transmitted?
Well, so the meme concept was introduced in Richard Dawkins' famous book, The Selfish Gene. And so his idea was that cultural elements that he called memes were like infectious diseases. They infected your mind, and he kind of implied that, as with the selfish genes, that there was an agency at the level of genes and memes, and there certainly are things that kind of answer to that description. So substance abuse, addictions, acts sort of like selfish memes, right? They're not good for you, but if, at least if people are susceptible, they may not be able to really effectively resist taking some dangerous or debilitating drug. But it seems to me that selection, if you want to think of it this way, in culture acts at several different levels. So on the one hand, we have selfish memes. On the other hand, most of the culture that we acquire is good for us, right? We learn skills and social institutions that favor our individual level fitness. Humans are, I mean, we're spectacularly successful, right? In terms of the human biomass on the planet. And also then we are very group oriented. So humans compete, firms compete with each other, countries compete with each other, religions compete with each other. So we have these group level adaptations, which are also seem to be really important. So the meme concept, I think, is I mean, there's no harm in thinking of cultural variance as memes, I guess, but the idea that there's only agency, so to speak, at the level of little particles of kind of cultural trait and in general, culture does a lot of things that such meme-like particles wouldn't do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's interesting that you refer to adaptations at the group level. So I would like to ask you, do you think that group selection operates at the cultural level, or that it also operates at the genetic level, and if so, how?
Well, so as I was saying, groups compete with each other, right? We're organized to compete with each other. So the churches, for example, have pastors whose job it is to try to attract recruits, right? To try to attract believers, and so the churches many churches are set up to proselytize and try to expand the church at the expense of other churches. So it seems to me that we see lots of cultural variation at the level of groups. So languages are an interesting example. The English people are genetically very different from, let's say, Danes and people from the immediate vicinity in the European continent, because, I mean, waves of migrants have swept over the British Isles for as far back as we can trace them, and so, for example, the Vikings seized large parts of Britain and pioneered there, and in the Middle Ages, and so the genetic difference between English and Danes is vanishingly small, right? And the difference between Portuguese people and Spanish-speaking people on the other side of the border is also vanishingly small, the genetic difference. On the other hand, languages are just the tip of an iceberg. Danish society is a bit different than English society, from many nations within Spain, right? So there's a lot of cultural variation at the level of subnational and national cultures. So in Britain, the Scots think of themselves as different from the English, and the Welsh think of themselves as different from the English, and even the Northern Englanders think they're different from the Southern Englanders, and I don't know Portugal well enough to say, but there's a lot of cultural variation at the level of pretty large groups, and and there's competition between those groups oftentimes, and so there's suggests that there's selection could take three different forms. One is, I mean, people can conquer other people and convert them to their way of life. I mean, the Latin countries were conquered by Rome and came to speak a Roman dialect, and the Latin countries are coterminous more or less with the Roman Empire, except in Latin America, where the Spanish and the Portuguese again they conquered large areas of territory and passed the Latin culture on to people who are mostly genetically Americans, right? Native Americans. So I think that so that's one form of cultural group selection. Another one is selective borrowing. So when society are successful, people imitate them, and when they're unsuccessful, then people tend to try to import ideas. A spectacular example is Meiji Restoration Japan, where the Japanese decided that they needed to acquire all of this technology and social organization that made the Europeans superior. So they very deliberately went out and hired American university professors and German military officers and British naval officers to come and train their students and army officers and naval officers. A third way is selective migration. So we see these streams of people from trying to come to Europe from Africa and Western Asia because the societies that they're from are broken, and European society works a lot better. So people are desperately trying to get from countries that don't work very well to countries that work better. And at least in the American experience, we've collected such immigrants in many waves, and by and large, after a generation or two, they're pretty American, and so we've American society is built largely on, well, almost entirely on immigration. If you think of the original pioneering settlers, plus all of the waves of immigration that have come since.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that we should also consider group selection as acting also at the genetic level, that is, as another level of natural selection acts on, or perhaps, or do you think that mechanisms like inclusive fitness and kin selection and reciprocal altruism are enough to explain how people develop a group identity, and then it is perhaps more cultural processes that contribute to that piggyback on those evolved cognitive processes and then expand them to include other people with whom we share a group identity but don't really have the chance to establish altruistic relationships with them, or something like that?
Well, so it seems to me that it's likely that this phenomenon of coevolution has completely reshaped our social psychology. Two critical elements of that, I think, are: one is that people are fairly docile. So you know, you and I, if we've never met, we could go into a bar in Lisbon or someplace and have a drink, and we'd be surrounded by other strangers, and we'd be pretty cool with all that. Now, chimpanzees are very distrustful of animals that they don't, other chimpanzees that they don't know. They consider them extremely dangerous. So I used to tell my students, the first day of a lecture, I've got 20 or 30 or 50 or however many students I've got in a class, and they all come in and sit down quietly and wait for me to say something and start the class. You could imagine trying to get, and they're all strangers. They're young, sexually active, or at least wish they were sexually active kids. And if you could get 50 stranger chimpanzees in the same room, I mean, you might drug them and put a hood over their heads and sit them in seats in the classroom and then pull the hood off and hoods off all simultaneously, and there'd be a sort of a social nuclear explosion. The walls of the classroom would fold out as these chimpanzees went nuts because they were surrounded by 50 strangers. So humans are comparatively easygoing in lots of circumstances. So that's one example. Another example is that kids very readily learn social norms and behave according to social norms. And Joe Henrich and one of his postdocs have a nice paper a few years back on how kids they sop up norms. People describe kids as moral Nazis. They're very strict about following rules, and almost to a comical stage. So humans are docile, they conform readily to rules. Not everybody does. Of course, we have psychopaths and people who don't conform to norms. But if you think of a dominance hierarchy, it's basically all psychopaths, right? Everybody's in a dominance hierarchy. Every individual is out for their own success in the group, and they care very little about the success of anybody else. And so humans manage to keep the frequency of psychopaths down to a few percent. So it seems to me that's likely. Well, I mean, it's an ongoing thing, right? What psychopaths end up incarcerated and their fitness is damaged, right? Oftentimes. So it's a situation where ongoing punishment, presumably, is a selective factor that keeps people in the frequency of norm following high and the frequency of norm violation low. And so that seems to me to be a product of a long history of group selection. So we call it the social instincts hypothesis, the idea that we've lived in tribal scale societies for at least 100,000 years or so, maybe much longer. And so our social psychology is adapted to living in rule-governed societies, and that's likely a product of cultural group selection, you think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just one last question. Do you think that it is possible for us, when it comes to our social psychology and the components of our psychology that are related to culture and cultural acquisition, to talk about things that are purely biological or purely cultural constructs? Do you think that is possible, or that we really always have to consider the interaction between those two aspects of our nature?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to wall off culture and biology and try to make them separate things. It seems to me it's think about the idea that kids have a capacity to imitate from the time that they're 12 months old or so. So not only has have culture and genes co-evolved in evolutionary time, but in the developmental process, we start mixing culture and genes in development by the age of 12 months. So so any genetic differences that there might be between individuals, personality differences, maybe those they certainly are said to be largely genetic by many people, but they're going to interact with the culture you acquire. So the genes and culture are going to co-develop as well as co-evolve, and so I think that trying to dissect out culture and separate it from genes is essentially an impossible problem, because the things have been entangled. This business of norm following is an example, if the tribal social instincts hypothesis is correct, and of a case in which there's a kind of a cultural imperative that's buried in our genes, that we're adapted to live in norm-governed societies, and so as it were, culture is smuggled critical elements into our genes that make fancy societies possible. And at the same time, during development, as I say, the developmental process is going to entangle genetic and cultural features in a way that makes it almost impossible to separate them. So I like to think of culture as part of our biology. It's like our arms and our legs. It's a part of our biology.
Mm-hmm. So in that sense, do you think that we could talk about culture as, for example, Richard Dawkins coined the term extended phenotype, that we could talk about culture as being part of our extended phenotype?
Yes, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That works for me.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Richerson, just before we go, apart from your books, which I already referred in the introduction of this video, and I will leave links in the description box to them, are there any good places on the internet where people can go if they want to get in touch with more of your work?
Well, certainly people can look at Rob's or my websites, and we have all of our not all of our recent papers, at any rate, going back 20 or 30 years. So you can find it. Well, I don't know. It'd take people a year to read all the stuff that's on our website. So there's plenty there, and most of our colleagues have good websites as well. If people are interested in animal culture, there are great books by Kevin Leyland and by Hal Whitehead on whales, and Kevin's done a lot of work. And the comparative primatologists, Mike Tomasello, has written quite a number of books. So there's and most of them also have websites where you can download their papers, and so yeah, there's lots of resources out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good, Dr. Richerson. So I would really like to thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. I really loved our conversation, so it was really a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Well, it's my pleasure to talk to you. Something I love to do is talk about what I'm interested in. So it's my pleasure, strictly.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. I've started this channel in February 2018, and so I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields, and I would really like to ask you just to consider visiting my Patreon page and making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. And so otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, and Brian Rivera. Thank you for all.